Chapter 28 Easter Sunday. It wasn't a thought exactly, more like an impression, kind of a dull throbbing in his brain. Amon rubbed the back of his head to make sure it wasn't just a headache. The throbbing remained, but he still couldn't identify it. Donkey? Virgin? Egypt? Bethlehem? The words kept beating at his brain, but Amon didn't know what they meant. Morning sunlight was just covering the city, and Amon watched. The warmth of its rays touched his skin, but could do nothing to melt the ice in his heart. He turned from the scene and walked across the roof to the ladder. Yuri and Jaden were sleeping soundly, and he left them that way. Better to have them sleep with its dreams, he thought, than to wake to the nightmares of this day. All the disciples were still sleeping as well, and Tamar was coiled in her father's arms. Amon's mother was nowhere to be seen, and the Roman Titus snored loudly on one of the table benches, his huge body stretched from one wall to the other. Amon grabbed a pot and decided to fetch his mother some water. There were few people out at this time of morning, and only one at the well. A woman, of course, and as Amon walked down the street toward the square, he watched her raise the bucket and dump it in her urn. But then, instead of lifting the urn to her shoulder and carrying her water home, the woman sat down on a bench and began to weep. Amon approached carefully, not knowing what troubled the woman. When he got close enough, he could see that she was not dangerous or mad, only sad. Though it was improper for a man to address a woman directly, Amon couldn't help but feel great compassion for her. "Peace to you," he said, and she jumped. "May I sit here?" Amon had no idea what he could say to a woman to cheer her up, but he was sure Jehovah would not want him to walk away or ignore her. "Peace and the blessings of Jehovah. Of course you may sit," she said, and moved to the side. Amon sat and stared straight ahead. Should I ask her what is wrong? It didn't seem the proper thing for a man of his age to do. Should he offer her his condolences on whatever tragedy she had suffered? It would be hard to know the words to say when you don't know the problem. "Forgive me," the woman said at last, eliminating Amon's dilemma. "The Romans crucified my son 2 days ago." Amon was quiet for a moment, then said, "They crucified my father 2 days ago, too." The woman looked at Amon, her forehead creased in concern. "My son was innocent," she said, without any hint of implying that Amon's father wasn't. "So was my father," Amon said anyway. The woman studied Amon's face for several moments, then said, "I am truly sorry for your loss. Your grief must be heavier than my own. My son was meant to die. It was the fulfillment of all that was to be." She turned away and finished saying, "But that does not make it easier to bear." It took a while for the woman's words to sink through Amon's pain, but then it clicked. "What do you mean he was meant to die?" he asked. "Mary?" The shout from up the street turned both their heads in that direction. "Mary! He's gone! They took him away!" the voice called. It took Amon a moment to identify the man running down the street as Peter, disciple of Jesus. "They took who away?" the woman sitting next to Amon asked. "Jesus!" Peter yelled, sliding to a stop, panting and out of breath. "The body of Jesus is gone." "But I don't under I don't understand either," Peter said, holding out his hand. "But come." Mary stood, took Peter's hand, and ran with him up the street, leaving her urn. Amon set his own pot down and followed close behind. They went out through the gate of the Essenes and through the camps of pilgrims, around the pool of serpents, and along the western wall to the other end of the city. They didn't stop until they had reached a garden area where tombs of the wealthy stood. Amon was panting hard as they stopped, but Mary seemed barely tired. In the center of the garden stood an open tomb. The large round stone used to seal the entrance had been rolled aside. Another disciple, Thomas, was already there, and Peter and Mary went inside. "It makes no sense," Thomas said to Amon when the other two had disappeared inside. "Why would someone steal the body of Jesus?" Mary and Peter came back out, their faces glowing with joy. "He is risen," Mary said, but Amon didn't understand what she was saying. "Why would someone steal the body of a dead rabbi?" Thomas asked again. "And why on the third day? Why not during the first night when the body is fresh?" Third day? Those words bounced around inside Amon's head. Bethlehem? Virgin? Donkey? Egypt? The dull ache in the back of Amon's head announced itself again. "Excuse me," Amon announced, though the others paid little attention. I must go." Amon wandered back to the city, thinking, and entered through the Damascus gate at the north end. He crossed through the wretched part of town, thinking it didn't quite look so dangerous in the morning, then to the baths at the south at the end of the temple. He went through the ceremonial bathing as his father had taught him, but somehow it just didn't seem the same. It seemed almost meaningless. When he had dried himself and dressed, Amon went up to the temple, caring not who might see him. He crossed the court of the Gentiles and entered the court of women. From there he could see through the twin brass doors to the temple. Men were climbing all over it, inspecting the damage. Soon the repairs would begin. But what will repair my heart? He wondered. He was standing there watching when from behind he heard the voice of a man. "Do you think the temple will ever be the same?" Amon recognized the voice to see Raphu, captain of the guard. "I think they will repair the building, yes," Amon said, turning back to face the temple. "But I do not think they can repair our devotion to it. The veil was torn in two, and God was not there. How can we ever treat the temple the same?" "The veil being torn was simply a result of the earthquake," Raphu said. "But it happened at a most peculiar time." "A coincidence. Nothing more," Raphu argued. "A happening of chance." Amon turned to the guard again. "You play games of chance," he said. "What do you think the odds are that the veil separating us from God was ripped at exactly the same moment Jesus died?" "I do not play—" Raphu stopped his lie and instead said, "I would not gamble on those odds in all my life." "Nor would I," Amon said. "So what do you think it means?" Amon sighed. "I think it means a miracle happened here," he said, "a miracle of chance. I think there is no God and that the veil being ripped in two just happened because it happened." Raphu nodded. "It would seem so," he said. "Otherwise you would have to believe in this Jesus person as the Messiah, and that clearly cannot be true. But still," Raphu said a few moments later, "there are few things that God leaves to chance. He does work in mysterious ways, you know." Amon thought about this, then said, "No, I do not believe he does, because I no longer believe there is a God." Raphu was quiet for several moments. "After watching the selfishness of our religious leaders," he said at last, "I have begun to think that myself." Raphu was silent for another long time, then said, "I came over here to see you for a reason." Amon said nothing, so Raphu continued, "I saw them march your father away to die." Amon's body started shaking, but still he said nothing. "I wanted you to know that he went bravely, with his head held high. He showed the Romans the true courage of a Jewish man." Amon gritted his teeth together and pursed his lips to keep from crying. When finally he had his throat under control, he said, "I thank you for telling me that. It is a comfort to know my father was strong." Raphu didn't know what else to say, so he drifted away into the crowd. After a time Amon also wandered away and back out into the court of Gentiles. As he passed through the crowds that were only now beginning to thin after the Passover celebration, it suddenly occurred to Amon that he had left his mother's pot down by the well, had never taken her any water, and in fact had never told her where he was going. He turned and headed for the south portico, and when he got there saw Roman soldiers guarding every entrance. "Halt!" one of them yelled, pointing somewhere behind Amon. "Stop there and hold on order of the Roman legion." Amon looked around curious to see who was in trouble, but kept walking. In seconds, 6 soldiers, taller than trees, it seemed, ran toward Amon with their armor clanking. They surrounded him, and the one who had given the order yelled in his face. "I told you to hold!" he screamed. "You would defy the Roman legion?" Amon looked from Roman face to Roman face in shock. "I I did not know you spoke to me," he said. "What have I done wrong?" "Silence!" the soldier yelled. "You will accompany us to Antonia. Pontius Pilate has ordered it." 1,000 thoughts flashed through Amon's head as 2 of the soldiers dragged him across the court of the Gentiles and down the steps to the fortress, his feet barely touching the ground. If only it had been this easy to get in the other day, he thought. His mind ran through a dozen reasons the Romans might want to arrest him, but by the time they reached the judgment court of Pilate, he had narrowed it down to one. Amon and Cornelius had conspired together to hide the centurion Titus. The Romans must have raided Amon's house after he left and were now ready to execute all those involved. As if in confirmation of this, when Amon was dragged into the judgment court, Cornelius was already there, standing to the side, waiting to be tried. Amon already knew what the sentence would be. "Is this the boy?" Pilate said, "the one from the house?" Cornelius looked at Amon, then said, "Yes, although by Jewish custom he is considered a man." "He looks like a boy to me," Pilate said, and Amon figured this wouldn't be a good time to argue the point. "Well, will he do it?" Pilate asked impatiently. "Allow me to inquire," Cornelius said, and by his formal speech Amon got the idea that Cornelius didn't want Pilate to know they were friends. "Boy," Cornelius barked to Amon, "your governor has heard stories of your great inventions, window rocks that you can see through, windmills on the ceiling, and water that runs from the wall on demand. Your governor would have you build such wonders for his palace." Cornelius finished, and the look on his face indicated it would be a good idea for Amon to agree. But Amon was tired, exhausted, and no longer cared about his own fate. "Perhaps the governor should have thought of that before he had my father killed," Amon said. A gasp swept across the gallery. No one had ever heard a man, let alone a Jewish boy, talk to Pilate like this before. "What is he saying?" Pilate asked, sitting up straight, confused. "I said, I have no desire to help the man who had my father crucified," Amon yelled, and now the people in the galleries started heading for the doors, not wanting to be anywhere near Pilate's wrath. Pilate threw up his hands. "I am confused," he said. "Will someone please explain what this boy is talking about?" Cornelius cleared his throat, then talked softly in Pilate's ears. "This is the son of the man Caiaphas sent to you for execution. He is saying he has lost all desire to work since his father's death sentence." Pilate turned to Cornelius. "You mean he's mad at me for giving the order to execute his father?" I believe that would be true, Governor," Cornelius said. Pilate thought for several moments. "Oh, very well," he said, with a wave of his hand, turning to Amon. "If I give you back the life of your father, then will you create for me these marvelous inventions?" Amon wanted to rip Pilate's eyes out. "You already killed him!" he screamed. "How will you give me back his life?" Total confusion now covered Pilate's face. He looked from Amon to Cornelius, then back again. He was about to say something when Cornelius stepped in. "Forgive me, Governor, but I do not believe the boy is yet aware." Cornelius turned to Amon and stared him in the eye. "That his father is still alive. He is being held in the dungeons of Antonia and is scheduled to be executed this very afternoon." Amon's eyes grew big, and for several seconds he did not breathe. He stared at Cornelius, wondering if he had heard correctly. "Well," Pilate said impatiently, "if I give you back your father's life, will you fill my palace with your inventions?" Amon was so dumbstruck that he couldn't speak for several seconds. Finally, he nodded his head and croaked, Yes, yes, of course I will." "Who is the man, and what is he charged with?" Pilate demanded, and Amon realized this was not yet a done deal. He was the man Caiaphas asked you to condemn last week," Cornelius said. "Jesus? I thought we already killed him." Yes, sir. No, I mean, no, sir, this was the man charged with stealing from their temple. A thief? I don't want thieves running around Jerusalem. No, sir, Cornelius said with such force that Pilate gave him a sharp look. He was not a thief. This boy here, he said, pointing to Amon, proved his father innocent, and that, in fact, it was the high priest himself who stole the money. Caiaphas? Stole from his own temple? Pilate leaned his head back and laughed. Now that is something to write Rome about. The governor laughed for several moments, then waved his hand again and said, very well, if the man is innocent, give him his freedom and tell Caiaphas not to touch him, or I'll audit his treasury myself. As you command, Cornelius said, snapping to attention. He handed Pilate a parchment on which to write the order, then Pilate stood to leave. But you, Pilate said, pointing to Amon, I want my windows filled with this glass, Governor, Amon said. Yes, this glass, by the end of the week. Pilate started to leave, but turned back yet again. On second thought, I would like a cool breeze over my bed. Build me your wind machine first. Yes, Governor, Amon said with a grin that filled his face. When Pilate had finally left, Cornelius quickly strode over to Amon and took him by the arm. Let us go free your father before Caiaphas hears of this, he said. Amon followed Cornelius down several stairways to the dungeon. It was much easier getting in this time, and it would be much easier getting out. Cornelius showed Pilate's order to the guards at the bottom of the stairs, and the gate was opened. They stood and waited as two of the guards went back into the dungeon. A few moments later they returned with Jotham limping between them. Father! Amon yelled, then ran to Jotham. They hugged and cried for several moments, then Cornelius tapped them on the shoulder. It would be best to leave this place quickly, he whispered. There is no order of Pilate's that cannot be changed on a moment's notice. Amon nodded, and they followed Cornelius back up the stairways, then outside through the front entrance of the fortress. I will leave you here, Cornelius said, but I will visit soon. Then he bent down to Amon and said, Never forget what Jehovah has done for you this day. Amon's face clouded over. I do not know that Jehovah had anything to do with this, he said. So far, all I've seen are false prophets and lies. Cornelius dropped to one knee, his bronze armor clanking in protest. He looked Amon straight in the eye. I have served Pilate and men like him for more than 3 decades, he said, and never once have I seen what I saw today. A man condemned is a man condemned, and a governor who wants something from a Jew simply gets it, or the Jew dies. The chances of Pilate releasing your father for any reason were impossible, yet it happened. I do not believe it was luck that saved your father. I believe the Spirit of God himself intervened on your behalf. Amon nodded out of respect, but was thinking how odd it was to have 2 conversations in one day about chance and coincidence, and one of them with a Roman. Cornelius crossed his chest with his right arm in salute of Roman soldiers, then went back to the fortress. My son, Jotham said again, hugging Amon. I thought I would never see you again. They embraced for several minutes, then started walking home. How is it that I was freed? Jotham asked. It took Amon half the distance to their house to explain. But why are you alive at all? Amon asked his father. I saw that your cell was empty, and everyone thought you had been executed. How did you see that my cell was empty? Jotham asked, and he was amazed to hear how Amon had tried to rescue him. They did indeed take us from our cells on Friday, Jotham said, finally answering Amon's question. We were being led out to be crucified when suddenly the earthquake hit. Everyone was thrown to the ground and the guards were scared. But when it was over, they went back to the business of killing us. Jotham stopped walking and closed his eyes, remembering that day. We saw Jesus on the cross, he said, and 2 of our number already hanging next to him. Jotham shook the memories from his head and opened his eyes again. At that moment, he continued, one of the Roman centurions went mad, screaming that he had killed the Son of God. Titus! Amon exclaimed. It was Titus! I do not know his name, Jotham said, but it took all of the soldiers to try to control him. He was a very large man. Yes, Amon said, he takes up half our house and snores like a bull. Jotham looked at his son, confused, but then continued his story. Eventually, the centurion escaped and most of the soldiers were sent to find him. Two others were ordered to return us to our cells until things calmed down. Amon shook his head in wonder. If Titus hadn't been struck with remorse at just that moment, he said to himself. What was that? His father asked. Oh, nothing, Amon said, just another coincidence. By now, Amon and Jotham had reached their house. Amon pushed open the door and saw his mother and brothers trying to force themselves to eat a noon meal. Tabitha looked up first, saw Amon, and was just about to ask who the visitor was when she recognized him. She screamed and jumped up, knocking over the table. Her two younger sons, covered in soup, began to protest. Then they too saw Jotham. Uri ran to his father instantly, but Jaden sat and stared as if afraid that what he saw was not true. Then Jotham called to his second son, and Jaden flew into his arms. The entire family fell on Jotham, hugging and crying and asking, "How can this be?" Eventually, Jotham and Amon got the whole story out, and Tabitha couldn't believe Amon would be working for Pontius Pilate. When finally the family started accepting that Jotham was really alive, Tabitha took him aside. "Bartholomew is in the upper room," she said. "He needs to know you are alive." Jotham nodded, then climbed the stairs with Amon right behind him. 8 of the disciples were there now, sitting around the table making plans. Blankets had been hung over the windows, and the disciples spoke in hushed tones. The bowls of rice and plates of broiled fish Tabitha had prepared for the men sat untouched on the table. As Amon listened, he could tell the disciples were scared and trying to decide what to do. "We must leave Jerusalem as soon as it is dark," one of them said, "and each of us go—" "Go where?" asked another. "Go home? We cannot go home. We cannot go anywhere. Caiaphas will find us no matter where we go." "What do you think, James?" the third one asked. It was then that Bartholomew turned and saw his friend standing behind him. He jumped up and spun around, staring Jotham in the face. "It is a ghost I see," he said, "or a demon in the skin of my friend." "It is neither," Jotham said. "It is I, in the flesh, still alive and a free man." Jotham and Bartholomew embraced, and a short explanation was given. Then Jotham asked why the disciples were meeting so secretly. "Caiaphas has many eyes and sharp ears," Bartholomew said. "Now that Jesus is dead, he will be rooting out all his followers and finding reasons to arrest them." Jotham said, stroking his chin. "Do you believe Jesus would want you to hide his message behind closed doors and covered windows?" "Jesus is dead," the disciple named Andrew said, pounding the table with his fist. "I no longer know if he was the Messiah or not, but I do know he is nothing now. His message was—" Andrew searched for the word. "His message was fanciful, sweet words in a sour society. They are not practical." "Love is always practical," Jotham said, and Amon was amazed that his father could speak clearly to a group of such knowledgeable people. "And it is those words which will some day sweeten this sour society, and all that came after it, and all that come after it." "How do you know?" the disciple named James spat out. "Did you follow Jesus for the last 4 years as we did?" "No," Jotham admitted, "but I was there at his birth, as was Bartholomew here, and my wife Tabitha, and I watched him grow and listened to him speak on many occasions. I was there when he fed 5,000 people with some loaves of bread and a few fish. I talked to people whom he healed and listened to people whose lives were changed. And in all of this, I know," Jotham concluded, "that Jesus not only spoke of love, he lived it as well. It was an eternal love which could only come from the Messiah." The hushed argument continued for some time until a pounding at the door below stopped it in mid-sentence. They listened as Tabitha greeted someone. Moments later, John and the other James came up from below. Amon thought they looked as happy as if they'd just come from a wedding. "He is alive!" they shouted, not caring about covered windows or closed doors. "We saw him!" This created bedlam, as the other disciples were excited and doubtful at the same time. The two described how they had been walking to Emmaus when Jesus came up and started walking with them. It could not have been him, Andrew said. You must have been mistaken. The argument continued, and Jotham leaned over to whisper in Amon's ear. Let us leave them to their discussions, he said. This is a matter for the chosen ones of Jesus. They slipped away from the group around the table at one end of the room and went to the stairway at the other. But just as they reached it, the room was suddenly filled for a moment with a bright light, and the air smelled as sweet as strawberries and as fresh as if they were standing atop a mountain. Standing in the middle of the room, where no one had been a moment before, was Jesus of Nazareth. Everyone in the room stared at Jesus, their mouths hanging open. Two of them fell back from the table and hid in a corner, terrified. Someone screamed, "It is a ghost!" But most of them were just shocked into silence. "Peace be with you," Jesus said, and Amon thought his voice had the strength of a lion and the gentleness of a lamb all at once. "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds?" he said. Then he held out his hands and said, "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." Amon saw the wounds and could not believe they could be made by anything but a rusty spike. Still, he had not seen Jesus on the cross and could not accept that a dead man was now alive. Then Jesus turned his gaze from his disciples and looked Amon in the eyes. And that's when Amon knew. Those eyes, those piercing, loving, knowing, and compassionate eyes, this was indeed Jesus, Amon decided. And before he knew it, Amon rushed to Jesus, fell to his knees, threw his arms around the Messiah's legs, and cried out, "My Lord and my God!" Jesus touched Amon's head, then pulled the young man's face up toward his own and smiled. He turned to his disciples and said, "Do you have anything to eat?" Amon sat at the table with them as Jesus ate some of the broiled fish Tabitha had prepared. Jesus explained many things then, saying, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms." Finally, Amon realized what the words going around in his head all day had meant. They were the prophecies, the evidence that would prove the identity of the Messiah when he came. Prophecies of his birth in a town called Bethlehem, of his fleeing to Egypt and arriving in Jerusalem on a colt, prophecies which could not be made up. Then suddenly, as the men were talking to each other, Jesus was gone. For a time another argument started as to whether Jesus had really been there or not. But Amon knew. Amon had touched him. And finally, Amon believed. Many days passed with Jesus appearing to hundreds of people, making believers of most and disciples of many. Then one day Amon, Tamar, and Jotham followed Bartholomew and the rest of the disciples up to the Mount of Olives. Tabitha walked with them as well, with Uri and Jaden under her arms. "Did you talk to Saul again?" Jotham asked Amon as they walked. "Yes," Amon answered. "He is so stubborn. I do not think he will believe even if Jesus stood right in front of him and struck him blind." Jotham laughed and gave his son a hug. It was after several moments of silence as they continued to walk that Amon asked his question. "Father, you really did see an angel when you were young, didn't you? All the stories you've told me, they were all true?" Jotham smiled and nodded. "Yes, my son. All those things were true. The angels I saw, the things I heard, the journey I took, the birth of Jesus, these were all true." Amon hung his head and looked away. "I have been such a fool," he said. "I have had the most special of fathers and thought him to be mad." Jotham pulled his son close. As he stroked Amon's hair, he said, "No, my son, you have not been a fool. You have been young, and now you have shown your maturity by allowing your mind to learn new things." Jotham stopped, took Amon's tear-stained face in his hands and turned it up so he could look into the boy's eyes. "And more than anything else you have done, that is the true sign of becoming a man." Amon hugged his father tightly. Then they continued walking. Soon they arrived at the top of the Mount of Olives, just on the other side of the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem. Jesus was with them, and he stood now in front of the group of believers. "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me," he said in such a loud voice that it echoed off the hills like thunder. "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." Jesus' robes began to glow a brilliant white. Suddenly he began to ascend into the air, and everyone gasped. "And lo, I will be with you always," Jesus said, as he rose, "even to the very end of the age." Amon fell to his knees, as did everyone else. He raised his hands toward heaven in complete submission, and watched as Jesus ascended higher and higher into the air. Now everything makes sense, Amon thought. Now the world is truly in order. And then Jesus was gone. Gone from sight, Amon thought, but not gone from my heart. He will never be gone from my heart. I will follow him always and do whatever he asks of me. And that, as it turns out, was just the beginning of Amon's adventures.